You're listening to TED Talks Daily. I'm your host, Elise Hu. And as part of our summer book club series, we are here with Saleem Reshamwala, host of another podcast from the TED Audio Collective called Far Flung. Hey, Saleem.
Hey, it's lovely to be here.
We're so excited you're here. Real quick, tell us a little about your podcast.
So Far Flung is sort of a travel podcast about ideas. Every story is a different place and kind of a look at an idea that flows from it. And we try to create this immersive soundscape to make you feel a bit like you're traveling while you're learning about some creative idea that comes from that place.
Yeah. For those of y'all who haven't heard it, it really takes you places, especially if you were stuck at your desk. The episode we're about to play today centers on the national language of Iceland, which is Icelandic, and how a younger generation is thinking about preserving that language. Say more about this.
You know, it's funny. This episode, we started out looking at exactly what you said, this challenge of preserving Icelandic when the population of Iceland is very, 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 very small compared to
small.
Lots of other nations that are kind of on the world stage. And we had all these experts we were talking to, and our producer on the ground talked to a group of teenagers who, many of them have relationships to immigration themselves. And it was one of those situations where the tape from them was so good that we ended up focusing almost completely on their story of how they're adjusting to the language and trying to adapt it to their mix of cultures themselves. And, you know, a lot of the stories on Far Flung this season are about migration and movement of people and people adjusting to cultures, even in places that people think of as monolithic, as a lot of people think of Iceland.
And that brings us to the book you chose for our series. It's a novel called Gold Diggers by Sanjena Sathian. Why'd you choose this book?
So the book is by an Indian American who grew up in the South. I also I'm mixed. I'm half Indian. My dad's from India. My mom's from Japan. But I grew up in the South, and I think a lot of people forget about the South when they're thinking about Asian Americans. Mm-hmm. So the narrative of the story is this boy, Neil, who is trying to struggle with not quite fitting in non-Indian circles as a kid, kind of fitting in Asian circles, just wrestling with all that. And it just seemed like off the jump, there was going to be a lot of stuff that was maybe similar to some stuff that I'd experienced or thought about growing up as a kid, even though my situation was quite different than Neil's.
Yeah.
And the way it's kind of dealing with this meta question of how should Asian Americans tell their story felt really relevant to so many aspects of Far Flung, where we're, you know, often working in collaboration with local producers, but telling stories of cultural mashups that, you know, we're not always necessarily deeply experienced in.
Okay, so we know why you chose the book, but can you just tell us a little bit about what happens in it?
Yeah.
Without spoiling anything.
Okay, I can do this with minimal spoilers, actually with no spoilers. Basically, there is a boy, Neil, who finds out that a friend of his is involved in maybe making some gold disappear, and that they have a little potion that might be conferring a bit of an advantage on them in the kind of immigrant hustle that's happening in suburbs of Georgia in the story.
I love this. There's magic. There's alchemy.
There's magic. It's a magical book.
How does it connect to the episode we're about to hear involving the Icelandic teens?
Yeah. So some of the teens have relationships to immigration, maybe a parent who is an immigrant.
Okay.
They're also looking for language to describe things that maybe they're the first person in their family to experience. Certain elements of race. You know, they're searching in the language for ways to describe their own experience growing up, Black in some cases in Iceland. And it's really similar to the way that I felt like Asian Americans of my generation were often trying to learn how to talk about their own situations. You know, there's this main character, Neil, and he has his AIM screen name, which that's a throwback, but basically like his handle. is...
So it's a period piece.
It's a period piece. It really is. Yeah, totally. His handle is Neil is Indian. And somebody makes a joke about it, and he's like, oh, but it's ironic. And that struck me so hard. Like, my handle on lots of things is Kid Ethnic, which is an ironic kind of joking wink at always being the ethnic kid growing up in the suburbs, kind of like Neil is the Indian kid. And when you miss the irony, you could feel like, oh, shoot, that's a really weird thing to be saying. And so I'm just constantly interested in this struggle of teenagers in any generation to figure out how to talk about themselves. And I love that you can find that anywhere. You know, I taught high school in Japan for years. And you see it in any group of kids that you're talking to. They're going to be wrestling with trying to use language to seem cool, trying to use language to fit in, trying to talk about things that no one has ever talked about before them.
Or in my case, trying to shun your mother language until it became cool.
That's right. That's right. And you know, that was such an interesting thing to see evolve. You know, I'm not sure what your experience with language growing up was, but like for me, seeing like even Indian song samples come up in hip hop felt like such a cultural shift, and I would cling to that anytime I'd see it. So, you know, it was kind of a natural fit looking at some of the ways that the characters in this novel are wrestling with that, hearing someone who is from a very different time period, these Icelandic teenagers kind of wrestling with, you know, different things, but still the influx of technology. Technology just always gives you new ways to define yourself. And it's new spaces where you have to use new language. And so Neil is like, you know, he figures out this AOL Instant Messenger thing. In Iceland, you know, some of these youth might have their mother tongue, which might be distinct from Icelandic. And then they've got Icelandic in their school and maybe around them quite a bit. And the internet is in English. The internet is not an Icelandic space for them. And that's just a constant thing they're wrestling with.
That's fascinating. The book is called Gold Diggers by Sanjena Sathian. It'll take you back to the AIM screen name days. And the podcast you're about to hear is Far Flung, hosted by our friend Saleem Reshamwala. Saleem, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Have you ever gotten in trouble for speaking English? Or, you know, I guess that would maybe apply more for, you know, using a lot of slang or something.
You know, I definitely, like, people have come up to me and be like, yeah, no, let's preserve the Icelandic. Let's only use Icelandic here.
What you're hearing is a group of teens in Reykjavik, Iceland.
Do you feel like you can lose the slang? Do you feel like you can carry on for a whole day where you just speak perfect Icelandic?
No.
No.
To be honest, no. I probably could if I was thinking, no, I can't use English, I can't use slangs, like through the whole day. And I was just like, okay, I have to use Icelandic.
I'm Saleem Reshamwala, and this is Far Flung. Every episode looks at a different place and the ideas that flow from it. And this week we take you to Iceland, a very beautiful country with a very small population and their own 1,200-year-old language. A language that's struggling to hold on in an increasingly connected global world. The tension for Icelanders is how to keep their culture alive while still embracing change. How would you describe Iceland to someone who has never been there before?
Well, Iceland is a gorgeous volcanic island in the North Atlantic Ocean.
That's our local producer, Anna Marsable Clausen. She's from Reykjavik herself and the head of podcasting at RÚV, Iceland's equivalent of the BBC.
We have mild winters and mild summers as well. In the summer, that's the best time because then everything is filled with light 24 hours a day and it's just gorgeous when the skies are pink and everything just feels a little bit more romantic somehow. Another important thing to know about Iceland is that culturally, it's the biggest village you will ever visit. Everybody knows everybody. We feel very close. You know, we feel like a little family.
How has Icelandic changed over time, the language itself?
So the best way that I can think of explaining that is that when my parents used a word that I didn't understand in Icelandic when I was a kid, they would find a synonym in Icelandic to explain it to me. And now, if I want to explain an Icelandic word to a teenager or a preteen or even kids, the fastest way to do it is not to use an Icelandic synonym, because then I actually might have to explain that as well, but to use an English word.
That's just how much it's changed over her lifetime. But Anna introduced us to someone who could take us through how the language has been changing across generations for centuries. Eiríkur Rugmansson, Professor Emeritus of the Icelandic language at the University of Iceland.
Icelandic comes from Old Norse, the common language that was spoken in Iceland and Norway and the Faroe Islands. And if you go further back, it was a common language in all the Scandinavian countries. And Icelandic has changed much less than the other languages. The phonology has changed a lot.
Phonology, that's the way a language sounds.
But we don't notice that because we do not have any recordings from Old Icelandics. We only have written texts. And the spelling is conservative. So the spelling is more or less the same as it was 800 years ago.
I ask a possibly ignorant question.
Yeah.
How do you know when the sounds in a language have changed in times before recorded audio?
In the case of Icelandic, we have a unique piece of text. It's called the First Grammatical Treatise. It is from the 12th century. It's a detailed description of the sound system of a language. And the author, his name is not known. He's just called the First Grammarian. He describes the individual sounds of the language by referring to the position of the tongue and the lips and so on.
Basically, someone described all the mouth shapes of how people talked in Iceland. And we can recreate those shapes and know that the sounds were very different.
We also can compare it to related languages like the other Scandinavian languages.
Since reading modern Icelandic is so similar to reading 800-year-old Icelandic, it lets you tap straight into history. But life in Iceland isn't what it was 800 years ago. For one, it's got more people.
It's grown a lot in the last few years with more immigration and, with more immigration. And of course, during the summertime especially, but with the tourist boom in general, we have so many more people here.
Before COVID, in 2019, Iceland had nearly 2 million visitors coming through, which is wild for an infrastructure that usually has to deal with just 370,000 people.
Yeah, so language, there's multiple things that have affected the Icelandic language. It's, of course, mostly the internet. But also the fact that we're not as homogenous anymore. We're not just, people who were born here and grew up here. But I think, we often talk about how immigration is affecting Icelandic. And that's definitely sometimes comes from a place that's somewhat racist. But tourism has affected Icelandic even more. Because now businesses have an interest in having, their signs in English. The restaurants have menus in English. Some businesses that, had Icelandic names before have changed them to English names and so on and so on.
In a way, everyone understands. It's more like laziness.
That's Armin Jakobsen, a professor of medieval literature at the University of Iceland and the chairman of the Language Planning Commission.
Like people are trying to cut costs by only having an English menu. But I think the Icelanders are, as a rule, very pro-Icelandic. But there's a foreign workforce. And the employers are reluctant to spend any energy or time or money teaching them Icelandic. Sometimes it's easier to teach them a few phrases in English. So this is another issue we face. That I think it's not exactly an attitude problem. It's more like an energy problem. People cannot really make the effort for Icelandic. I guess they're not scared enough.
What does that mean, they're not scared enough?
It's obvious that this is not a large population. But to Icelanders themselves, it's not as obvious. Like, we are the center of our own universe. And this is a problem for business, because like it's worth the effort to translate everything for a nation of 10 million or 20 million or 30 million.
But for only 370,000 people, that's not always commercially viable.
So we need to spend far more energy trying to convince people that it's not worth doing than other languages would. And this is mostly what we're up against. Just we are too few.
So interesting thinking of it as a market problem in a way, or a market, like it being a profit incentive challenge for folks.
But money rules the world, you know. That's it, you know. We may not like it, but money changes everything in all situations. And this is something the Icelandic Language Commission is up against.
For folks who don't know what the commission does, how would you describe that to people?
Well, hardly anyone knows what we do, but we are mostly helping with policy. So it's a very tiny institution. We try to identify the dangers facing the Icelandic language and make a report every year. And these reports have been used by the government to make language policy. And we have a symposium once a year, and we sometimes write strongly worded letters to organizations if we feel they have done something bad in regards to the Icelandic language.
In the battle to save Icelandic, these are pretty amiable shots. Strongly worded letters are sent when people should have used Icelandic instead of English, or to the airport when the signs in English are in a larger font than Icelandic. They'll point that out and request a change. Some people make the changes, some don't. They also get positive reinforcement going with kind letters. For example, they wrote to a sports team because they used the Icelandic first names on the back of their shirts instead of their last names. Iceland has a different naming system than most Western languages. Icelanders are known by their first names. So they sent a nice note to say, hey, you're doing things right. What other committees do I need to know about to get the sense of the committee's influence on language in Iceland?
So then there's the language planning department, or Málræktarsvið Árnastofnunar, which more literally translates to the language growing department, which is nice. You know, like you would grow plants, you grow the language. And so the language planning department maintains the Icelandic dictionary and guides the public when it comes to the making of new words and how they are used. And they actually have a website where the public can send in ideas for new words.
But even with a stream of new words in Icelandic, there's still tension around language and how it's used.
So the older generations tend to get very caught up in the slang that the older generations don't understand, and therefore think is stupid, right?
That sounds not too different than what might happen in other countries.
Exactly. So that's just like a general thing that happens everywhere. The older generations don't understand the younger generations, and vice versa to some extent. But what happens in Iceland that might be a little bit different is that the younger generations aren't as good at grammar as the older generations. And older generations get very hung up on it and have for decades. But now there's a big movement where people are really trying to get each other to stop focusing so much on how kids use the language and just be happy that they're using it at all.
Eiríkur, our Icelandic language professor, he emphasized that it shouldn't feel like a war against the way young people are talking.
I mean, it's of course good for young people to learn English. It's important. I have always emphasized that English is not our enemy. Young people, they are online 24/7, so to speak, and they're directly connected to the English-speaking world. In Icelandic TV, all foreign programs are either dubbed in Icelandic or subtitled. But young people do not watch linear TV. They watch Netflix, where many programs are not subtitled in Icelandic, or they watch something on YouTube or whatever. So they're much, much more exposed to English than we used to be some decades ago.
What he's talking about here is something called digital minoritization.
So even if children go to school and they speak Icelandic there and they speak Icelandic to their parents and so on, but they spend a lot of their time in the digital domain where Icelandic is not the main language.
Think about how much language input you get from your phone in a given day. I mean, probably including me talking right now. And talkback chatter from Siri and Alexa and Google Assistant. There's a startup in Iceland that does AI with natural language processing that's trying to tackle that side of things. But for now, English is everywhere digital. So remember those teens we heard at the beginning of the episode? They, like most young people in Iceland, live this every day. That's after the break.
Do you remember when you first realized English existed?
To be honest, I don't really remember it much because I feel like it's just always been in my life, you know. My name is Anna. I am turning 16 and I am from Iceland. I'm also like half from Burkina Faso. But like I've grown up here all my life. I learned English from watching YouTube videos mostly and like social media, because everything is in English there. My name is Vala. I'm turning 19 and I'm from Nigeria, but I got adopted to Iceland when I was 10 months old.
When I was growing up, my parents spoke English to me. Even though they spoke Amharic to each other, they spoke English to me. My name is Johanna and I'm gonna be 18 this May, and my parents are from Ethiopia, but I was born in Iceland, so I have Ethiopian origin. Yeah, I always watched Cartoon Network when I was little. I almost always watched US children's shows and like that.
It's funny, I learned English from Cartoon Network and from reading Harry Potter. Because they didn't come out quickly enough in Icelandic, you know.
Oh.
So I just sat there with my dictionary and my Harry Potter book in English, and then I'd have to ask, Mom, what are muggles? What's
How did you find Anna, Johanna, and Vala? How did you find them? How did you connect with them? How did the conversation start?
So I had interviewed Anna before because she uses TikTok, and so I was researching TikTok this one time and spoke to her, and I found her to be...
Did you find her via TikTok?
Yeah, somebody pointed her out to me.
Amazing. Everyone finds everyone via TikTok now.
Right. What a world.
It's, of course, a world their generation has grown up in, and yeah, language-wise, it's a world that is very weighted.
So how much time do you spend online in English versus Icelandic?
Wait, do you mean in like Snapchat groups and talking to my friends?
No, aren't you talking about like just the world, like social media and like that, what we're reading in the news and like that?
Yeah, all of it.
Yeah.
Like 100% English.
Yeah.
So often you're just going to get a lot more information if you find it in English than in Icelandic. It's so limited if you search it in Icelandic. You can barely find anything.
So when do you use Icelandic versus English? Do you ever speak English just between yourselves or with your friends, or?
I usually just speak Icelandic with my friends. I use a lot of English slang, so that it definitely incorporates into how I speak with my friends. But then also I work at a restaurant where a lot of people are English and a lot of tourists are coming, so I also speak a lot of English there. So, like my mind, I sometimes think in Icelandic and I sometimes think in English. It's kind of weird. Sometimes it just comes out a big blur when I'm speaking because I'm thinking in one language and speaking in another. It gets kind of confusing sometimes. Yeah, for me it's like sometimes when I don't know the Icelandic, like I know something in English and know the version in English, but I can't remember the Icelandic word. I write it in Google Translate in English and then find the Icelandic word. Most kids now use like TikTok slang, which is actually like African American vernacular English. When we're saying something we find it funny, we might use that slang instead of like speaking Icelandic, because that makes more sense in a way.
even just those words, African American vernacular, which all of you pronounce beautifully and you say and you use, how would you translate African American vernacular into Icelandic?
Afrísk, amerísk, I don't even know.
Vernacular. You're thinking I don't even know the Icelandic word for vernacular.
No.
So you know what the words mean, but you can't find similar words in Icelandic.
I think it's because our language is so new, so we don't have words for everything that need to have words for.
It's quite old, actually. It's like one of the oldest languages.
Okay, I take back what I said.
But we don't have many new words.
Yeah.
Also, Icelanders like to have their language just like stick to the old rules and like that. They don't like to switch up and take other words inside the language because it will ruin the beautiful Icelandic language and like that.
Yeah.
So they're kind of strict on their rules.
People think of slang and young language users, but obviously slang as a concept isn't new.
Sýna.
Yeah, sýna.
Yeah.
Like seen.
It's
Like
like
when
leaving
it's-
somebody, just like when you open their message and
Leave them on red.
Yeah, that's called sýna in Icelandic.
Yeah.
Well, not in Icelandic.
No.
Well, it's
no.
Icelandic because we changed it, you know.
We've like
To fit
Icelandicated
Yeah.
it.
Nice word.
But I absolutely think that we use more slang than the older generations, and I also think that they don't often understand what we mean. Like I learned that the word hypið is actually an old Icelandic word, because I thought like hype was just an English word for having fun and being pumped. But then it was like, it means like something was really close, like something like it's really close to happening. I'm hype eitthvað gerist.
Barely.
Yeah, barely.
I was like, barely a chance it'll happen.
Yeah, and I was like, oh, I thought that was an English word. I didn't even know that's an Icelandic word.
There's an experience I think a lot of people have had when speaking languages. It's one where you can feel more comfortable with certain words or phrases when not speaking in your native tongue. Take the word sexy, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think like no one says kynþokkafull. It sounds so
Old.
gross.
Like, oh, you're so kynþokkafull.
Yeah. I think sexy is a lot better than
also
kynþokkafull. I feel like when
also
someone
like cute instead of like
yeah. I also use cute a lot more than sæt or sætur.
Really?
yeah, he's really cute.
Because I think it's more chill to say yeah, he's cute rather than say oh, hann sætur. I feel like it's more just like yeah, you're fine, you're good looking. But when I say þú ert sætur, I feel like there's more to it. I don't know why. I feel like it's sometimes when I use English words, I feel like it's more laid back. Also like sorry, I don't feel like that's the same as saying fyrirgefðu.
Yeah. Sorry, it's just like when you bump into a person and you're like, oh, sorry. But fyrirgefðu is like
I'm genuinely sorry for what I did.
Like, I'm apologizing to you.
Mm-hmm. So the language creates a distance because Icelandic is more serious and English is more laid back.
Yeah.
It's maybe because, you know, we watch so much like English media, English TV shows, so we associate it with more like chill, laid back, just having fun instead of like seriousness when we're reading Icelandic news or something like that.
So sometimes a word for whatever mix of media and cultural influences might be at play just feels better in one language than another. But there's also moments when the teenagers Anna spoke to think the Icelandic words they need just aren't there.
I remember when we were doing like a post the other day, and it was about cultural appropriation. When we were translating it to English from Icelandic, and the Icelandic word is menningarnám. So if you put it in like Google Translate, or if you just read the word and translate it, it will be cultural studies.
Yeah, that's what that came from me, and I was like, what?
And then I was like, did you go over it before you before you sent it? Because cultural studies is not the same word, you know. So it was just like a funny moment because you're maybe just writing fast and it will come like cultural studies because you just say menningarnám.
Yeah.
When you're
But
using Google Translate, it'll come menningarnám.
It's just like many words that are English, and the English word has like POC, people of color. We don't have that word like for like the black experience, many words that the English words has, we don't have words for that.
Huh?
Like people of color, we don't kind of have a word like leta.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't have it. If you translate later, it will translate to colored, which is like not the best way to describe people of color today. So yeah, it's just outdated, and we don't really have a word to describe people of color in Icelandic rightly.
So it's not so then you're not just taking exclusively like black people or Hispanic people. There's no like word that
says non-white people.
Yeah.
Well, we have words, but they're terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah, that also.
yeah. Also, like all the old words that were used to describe like black people are not okay anymore, and you can't say them. And then they're like we have like black, just like sorted.
No, we have so many words to describe black people in Icelandic, but then we have like one word to describe a white person almost.
But it's interesting too because we have a committee that makes up new words when there are new words in English or new technology or something that we need to translate into Icelandic. Mm-hmm. And as the media, we run into a lot of problems with what word are we supposed to use for people of color? And what word are we even supposed to use for Hispanic people or black people? And this is something that that committee could decide on. It could say, hey, this is the good word for that. These two words, they're great. Except there are no people of color.
Yeah, that's what I think. It would be like horrible if they choose the word that's like really outdated, and they would be like, yeah, that's the word we're going to use for you. And everybody that's like of color would be like, you can't use that anymore. And it's also like sometimes they just use this like hörnstökkir, but that doesn't, like, people of color can come in like any shades. They aren't always like dark skin. They sometimes might be light skin.
Yeah.
So, how would you say Icelandic people think of English? So, for example, French is the language of love. Danish is the language of potatoes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Icelandic is the tough language.
But what is English? How do you think of English?
I think it depends on the age group of the people you'll ask. Like, if it's old people, they'll be like, oh, the language that's ruining Icelandic, and it's totally ruining the youth of this beautiful country that we live in. And then it's like young people, they'll be just like, oh, the language of media. It's just a matter of time until we use more English, and I think that we'll start using much more English in Iceland after like 20 years or something. So I think it just depends on who you ask.
Which language do you prefer, English or Icelandic?
I think it depends on the situation. Like, when I'm speaking to old people and trying to be extremely proper, I will speak Icelandic and don't have any slangs, and I'll speak old Icelandic, like old the way they speak. But when I'm speaking to like kids, I think like when I was doing youth center, I spoke a lot, like I used slang because the kids understood slang. They might not understand like the old words because we don't use them anymore.
Do you feel like you code switch?
Yeah, kind of.
I mean, that must be a type of code switching, right? When you use a different language for speaking to different age groups.
Yeah, especially like when old people like start talking to me in English, then I switch to extremely proper Icelandic. I don't mess up. I'm like, I'm going to show you that I speak Icelandic.
But if you were to ask someone on a date, which language would you do it in?
I would always do it in English because I can't take myself seriously enough to be like, viltu fara á stefnumót með mér? I just always feel like I'm less formal when I speak English, and because I don't take myself too seriously most of the time, that's why I use so much slang. So yeah, I would probably, I don't think I've never asked someone on a date, to be honest, but if I get asked, it's usually at least one word in English.
I think I would never say like the Icelandic word for date, which is stefnumót, because it would be so formal. I think that the person would say no.
Yeah, literally.
If somebody would ask me, viltu fara á stefnumót? I would be like, are you okay?
No.
I can't help but imagine the brutal pain of carefully asking someone out in your national language and the response being, are you okay? But for Johanna, it would be so unusual that it would just feel off. Okay, so people might have a preference for certain phrases in certain situations to be in English, but what does or doesn't that say about the future of Icelandic?
Do you think it's important for Iceland to preserve its language and create new Icelandic words, or should Iceland adapt to the times?
So this is, I've actually asked myself this question quite a few times. I definitely think we should preserve Icelandic, but I don't think there's anything wrong with, using English slang. It doesn't mean that it's gonna affect the whole language, There's nothing wrong with saying beilaði or makar sense. It's not gonna kill anyone. Like, you can adapt to the times but still speak the language.
I think that you have to be open for changing the language because so many different experiences and so many different groups of people don't have a word for them in our language, like LGBTQ people and non-binary people. They're trying to create new words to describe the experiences that people have. And so it's so important to allow people to be who they are and make a word for them or find a word so they can describe them.
So they don't feel excluded from the language.
Yeah. And I also think that applies to people of color. You have to, allow the language to change to give groups of people that have been discriminated against a word to describe them that isn't derogatory.
I can imagine that it's actually pretty hard for a population so much smaller than most nations to come up with nuanced words for topics that, in a lot of cases, might just be entering the national conversation. And when the word's not there yet in Icelandic, it's there floating close at hand in the digital ether, in English. Here's J.R.R. on some of what needs to be addressed moving forward.
Difficult to say. I mean, I think it's this National Language Technology Program, I think it's very important for several reasons. One is that it enables us to use Icelandic in communicating with Siri and Alexa and all kinds of equipment. And another thing is that it might change the attitude of young people. Research has shown that the attitudes of young people towards their mother tongue is the main factor with respect to the vitality of the language. If young people have negative attitudes towards their mother tongue, the language is doomed. If we cannot make young people care about their language and want to use it in all domains, the language will die sooner or later.
You're touching on something that's really intriguing to me. When you think about the survival of Icelandic, you're bringing up as one of the key things that it depends on these young folks speaking it, wanting to use it, or as you point out, having a positive attitude towards it. Mm-hmm. I'm always curious. I think of the metaphor of some people say a carrot and a stick, or with educational media, for example, I often think of how do you make this not be the broccoli, the vegetable that the kid has to have but doesn't really feel excited to have. Mm-hmm. Sorry if you love broccoli.
Yeah, a few years ago, we asked young people what comes to mind when I mention Icelandic and what comes to mind when I mention English. And when we mentioned Icelandic, they said, oh, I think of something obligatory and I think of corrections, wrong usage and so on. But when we mention English, they think of travel and entertainment and so on. I think we have to change how we teach Icelandic in schools. We should not focus on grammar and correcting the usage of Icelandic and so on. We have to make this more interesting and more exciting for them. I think we need to allow children to play with language. We're always telling young people how they should speak, and we're not listening to how they want to speak. It's always the grown-ups that decide.
Trying to stop all change, well, that would be a fool's mission and massively inconvenient. But maybe keeping Icelandic around starts with just recognizing how amazing it is that it's made it this far.
I'm always trying to tell people that we must not forget that it is in fact a miracle that a language community with only 370,000 speakers has its own language that is used in all domains. And if we want it to remain that way, we must do something about it. We must spend more time and money teaching Icelandic to immigrants. We must spend more money on language technology. But the most important thing is positive attitude towards the language.
Anna said that as such a small community, rather than think in terms of fighting off external languages or cultures, they should lean into how those external connections interact with their own language and culture. It'd be easy to assume that English is just sort of steamrolling Icelandic out of the culture, but that would be a really limited view.
Are you proud that you speak Icelandic?
Yeah, I think it's really cool that I know this tiny language that everybody thinks is hard to learn, which it is. I mean, I've lived here all my life, and I still I'm not a pro Icelandic. I don't know how to
Conjugate.
I don't know how to conjugate in every word in the world, you know?
Yeah. I think it's so funny because you're like almost a part of an exclusive club. You're like, I am one of like maybe top like 400,000 that knows this language.
Yeah.
Far Flung is produced by
Eric Newsom
and
Jesse Baker
of Magnificent Noise for TED. Our local producer for this episode is
Anna Marsipil Clausen.
Our production staff includes
Sabrina Farhi,
Elise Blennerhasse,
Huete Gitana,
Ben Chang,
Sammy Case,
Jimmy Gutierrez,
and
Michelle Quint,
with the guidance of
Roxanne Highlash
and
Colin Helms.
Our fact checkers are
Nicole Bodie
and
Paul Durbin.
Ad stories are produced by Transmitter Media. Our executive producer is
Eric Newsom.
I'm Saleem Reshamwala.
So it used to be that when you met Americans, when you were abroad and you met Americans and they learned that you were from Iceland, they would ask, so is it true that Iceland is green and Greenland is icy? Which is apparently a fact from a movie called The Mighty Ducks 2. So that would be the
funny
only
thing
thing.
I remember totally thinking I was cool as a kid for knowing that Iceland's the green one and Greenland's the icy one. I was totally that person.